My daughter looked into my eyes and said the greatest gift would be if I simply died. The silence that followed was crueler than any scream. In that moment, I realized something inside me was breaking. Not just my mother's heart, but also my trust in everything I had built. How could someone born from my womb wish for my absence as if it were a favor? The venom of that sentence coursed through my veins like cold fire. I'd believed for years that love endured all, that my dedication would be remembered and respected. But now I was faced with a truth that cut deep. My sacrifice had become cheap currency, used and discarded. And yet, behind the pain, a spark ignited. When you discover that your own life is being treated as a burden, what's at stake isn't just pride. It's dignity itself, the sense of existing without shrinking from cruelty. I held in my hands more than memories. There were papers, decisions, signatures that sustained the comfortable life she felt she deserved. And suddenly, this structure seemed fragile, like a house of cards at the mercy of a breath. Is it possible that the greatest blow comes not from sworn enemies, but from those who bear their blood? The question echoed within me like a slow drum, demanding an answer. And that answer wouldn't come in silent tears. Life sometimes becomes a chessboard where we believe we are defenseless pawns, but where, at the right moment, we can reveal ourselves as the queen who moves everything. A rejected mother can become an unexpected force, invisible until the moment of change. 7 days. That was all the time it took to transform the wound into a weapon, the humiliation into courage. Every cold look from her became fuel. Every unspoken word at dinner became a reminder. And what began as a poisoned sentence grew inside me like an earthquake about to break the surface. She thought I would die in silence. But she didn't realize that silence also harbors thunder. I stood before her, as if the ground had opened up beneath my feet. The phrase still echoed, repeated through my mind like a wound that wouldn't heal. The best gift would be if you died. It's strange how certain words not only wound, but shaped the air around them, changed the texture of the silence, transformed the entire room into an invisible courtroom. I saw her reflection in the window. Her impatient face, her hard eyes, as if she were speaking of some burden, not the woman who gave her life. That night, alone in my room, I felt the weight of every sacrifice I'd made. The poorly sewn clothes I'd worn to pay for college, the cold meals I'd eaten because I was busy making sure she had hot food, the dreams I'd silently swallowed so as not to disrupt her future. With each memory, a question burned within me. When did my love become an uncomfortable obligation? It's at times like these that our minds fill with images we didn't ask for. I found myself walking down a dark hallway, the walls lined with portraits of her at different stages of her life, and each painting silently asked me if I'd messed up somewhere. Perhaps you've felt this too. The feeling of being invisible to those you fought so hard for. As if everything had been just a forgotten detail, erased by the rush of the world. But it is precisely in this emptiness that an unexpected strength is born. When dignity is threatened, the heart learns to defend itself. It was in that moment that I understood that I still had a voice, and more than that, I had choices. And perhaps this is the reason why so many people stay with me, following each revelation, because they understand that life tests us in cruel ways, but there is always a way out that gives us back our power. I still didn't know exactly which path to take, but I felt deep inside that the turnaround had already begun, even if silently. And it was this silence that held the key to something my daughter could never have imagined. The next day dawned heavy, as if the air had been filled with an invisible fog. Every movement inside the house seemed charged with silent tension. The sound of the kettle on the stove was too metallic. The creak of the chair sounded like a muffled scream. I watched my daughter walk around the living room, nonchalantly fiddling with her phone, unaware of the earthquake she had left inside me. On the outside I remained calm, but inside, every second felt like walking barefoot over shards of glass. Her words not only hurt me, they began to reconfigure everything I believed to be the foundation of our relationship. I'd always believed a mother's love was unshakable, but there, in that absence of affection, I discovered an even crueler emptiness. The realization that my worth had become a worn-out coin. It was as if my existence had lost its color, like an old photograph forgotten in the back of a drawer. And yet, amidst the pain, a shadow of clarity emerged. While I feared losing everything, I also began to realize the extent of the power that still rested in my hands. Her dependence wasn't just emotional. It was practical, concrete. Every good thing, every comfort she displayed before others was sustained by my decisions, my signatures, the effort of a lifetime. It was a stark contrast. While I felt invisible, my work sustained her visibility. This contradiction kept me awake at night. I found myself faced with two images. On one side, the portrait of the frail mother, her eyes downcast, accepting herself as a burden. On the other, the figure of a woman standing, her hands steady, holding the key to everything. Between these images I wavered, unsure which to choose. And it is precisely in this space of indecision that the mind begins to devise dangerous, yet also liberating paths. I couldn't reveal anything yet, not even to myself. But something was being sown in the silence, an invisible thread that, when pulled, would change the entire pattern of our story. Sometimes, silence weighs more heavily than any argument. In the days that followed, I realized my daughter didn't even notice my absence. I could be there, sitting at the table, and still feel like a ghost. It was as if my presence had become nothing more than a discreet shadow, neither disturbing nor comforting. This indifference hurt more than the cruel words she had said to me, because it showed that this wasn't a moment of anger, but something deep-rooted, cold, and calculated. At those times I began to see the house differently. Every object seemed to carry stories that only I remembered. The worn sofa from the nights I'd rocked her feverishly, the kitchen tiles I'd washed until my hands cracked, the table where she'd done her math homework while I dreamed, silently, of days of recognition. Everything there bore witness to a love that was now treated as a burdensome burden. It's curious how the same space can be seen through different eyes. For me, it was a living memorial. For her, merely a functional backdrop. And it was in this realization that something inside me opened. I realized it wasn't just a matter of pain, but also of legacy. What we do, what we offer, what we leave behind can be used as both a bridge and a weapon. There are those who choose to cross, and there are those who try to push us off. This ambiguity gave rise to a painful clarity. Perhaps I needed to use the same structure I built, not to sustain, but to reveal. Each night, lying in my room, my mind raced. Fear and courage alternated like waves. At times I felt small, crushed by the weight of rejection. At others, I looked up in the darkness and felt a new strength emerge, as if each tear I shed were also a brick in the construction of something greater. It's at this point that many feel the urge to support this journey, leaving a silent sign that the message touched them. Because it's not just my story, but a wound common to so many mothers, so many women who learned to smile even when their hearts were bleeding. And the more this clarity took hold of me, the more I realized. The true turning point was still hidden, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I began to notice that her rejection wasn't just evident in her harsh words, but also in her small, everyday gestures. The way she looked away when I spoke, as if my sentences were too annoying to deserve attention. Her rush to leave the room whenever I entered, as if my presence contaminated the air. These forced silences had an almost physical weight, and in each one I felt the confirmation that the bond between us had been cruelly severed. At night, when sleep stubbornly refused to come, my mind would paint scenarios. I'd picture myself in an open field, where sunlight illuminated half the space and the other half remained plunged in shadow. That's exactly how I felt, torn between the pain that weighed me down and a secret hope that, despite everything, still burned within me. The darkness told me I was alone, lost forever. But the light, however fragile, insisted on reminding me that the story wasn't yet over. This contrast kept me awake and, in a way, alert. Because if the shadow oppressed me, it was also what pushed me to seek clarity. It was in this balance, in this back and forth between loss and conquest, that I realized something essential. I could choose which side to remain on. And this choice, silent and invisible to those who despised me, was already beginning to change the course of events. Still, the fear wouldn't go away. It lurked in the cracks of dawn, whispering that perhaps it was too late to reverse course. But along with the fear came an almost electric sensation, as if something were about to be revealed. A secret I myself hadn't yet dared to name, but which already breathed in the shadows of my life. It was like walking down a narrow hallway, knowing a door awaited at the end. I couldn't see the lock, I didn't know the key, but I could feel the pull of what lay beyond. And it was this feeling, as unsettling as it was irresistible, that kept me standing, waiting for the next step that would change everything. There were nights when I would wake with a start, my heart racing, unsure whether it was the silence of the house that woke me or the memory of her words burning once more into my mind. The darkness of the room seemed alive, filled with ancient voices, as if each shadow reminded me of the sacrifices made in silence. At the same time, a soft light filtered through the cracks in the window, almost timid, but enough to tell me that all was not lost. This duality haunted me in every gesture. When I walked around the room, I saw the objects arranged as if they were pieces of a lifetime. The vase I'd received for a forgotten birthday, the books I'd read on lonely nights, the photo of her smiling as a child, before contempt took over her gaze. Every detail carried an ambiguous weight. It was both memory and wound, a sweet memory and a sharp knife. I felt two worlds colliding within me. On one side, the fear of total loss, of definitive loneliness, of the emptying of everything I once gave. On the other, the quiet flame of hope, which insisted on reminding me that even dry branches can blossom when least expected. It was like standing before a cracked mirror. Part of me reflected the pain of being discarded, while the other part was already trying to find a new light, one I myself didn't yet understand. This tension wasn't just internal. It was beginning to seep into the way I looked outward. When I passed neighbors who greeted me coldly, I noticed their sidelong glances, as if my color and age were invisible or, worse, irrelevant. It was a kind of social silence that reinforced the abandonment I experienced at home. But at the same time, there were moments when an unexpected gesture, a nod of recognition, reminded me that there was still room to be seen. And it's in this gap between shadow and light that something bigger begins to form. A bated breath, a premonition that the coming days would bring not only answers, but also revelations no one could have imagined. It was in this state of constant vigil, between sleepless nights and heavy days, that I began to see the small cracks in what had once seemed solid. My relationship with my daughter was no longer just an emotional abyss. It was also a silent battlefield, where every gesture, every word, became proof of a game she believed she had already won. I, however, learned to observe. Like someone studying the wind before a storm, I silently noted the signs that could be transformed into weapons. There were days when she'd leave papers scattered across her desk, unaware I was paying attention. Contracts, receipts, little traces of her greed. Every detail seemed to scream how much she depended not only on what I'd built, but also on my signature, on my trust. It was like watching a castle built on fine sand, beautiful on the outside, but ready to crumble at the slightest calculated move. At the same time, I noticed how my discreet stance was beginning to provoke unexpected reactions. The silence that had previously crushed me now bothered her. My daughter sought the confrontation I refused, because, without realizing it, she sensed something in me had changed. And it's curious how, often, the greatest power lies not in shouting, but in the silent gaze that carries secrets. In that setting, I felt like someone planting seeds in arid soil. I knew I wouldn't see flowers immediately, but every silent gesture was a preparation. With every step, the tension grew, as if the house itself harbored the premonition that something was about to happen. Perhaps this is the point at which many who listen to me recognize themselves. The moment when pain stops being just a wound and begins to transform into a strategy. And that's why people so often feel the urge to let their own reflections echo, almost as if each comment were a silent testament that they are not alone on this path. And as the pieces slowly moved, I understood. The game wasn't yet decided. The true impact would only be revealed at the right moment, when the masks began to fall before everyone's eyes. I realized that my every movement, no matter how small, altered the atmosphere in the house. The silence that had previously suffocated me now took on a new meaning, as if it were a curtain about to part and reveal something. My daughter, accustomed to my submissive gaze, was beginning to feel uneasy about my calm. There was unease in her gestures, like someone who feels the ground shaking without understanding the source of the threat. Sometimes I'd watch her from afar, sitting on the couch, talking loudly on the phone about plans involving money, travel, and ostentation. Her tone was full of assurance, as if her future was secure. But to me, it sounded like the song of someone unaware of the approaching storm. I knew that behind every word lay dependence, and that was the gap that gave me strength. Inside me, tension built like ropes stretched to their limit. Hope and fear mingled, because planning something so delicate required caution. At the same time, a part of me lit up at the possibility of finally being heard, not just by her, but by everyone who had witnessed my silent pain. It was like walking down a dark road, where each step revealed stones and yet also revealed the faintest line of light on the horizon. I felt my silence no longer just defense, had become language, strategy, response. And the more I held back my words, the more my daughter seemed to lose control. The contrast was almost palpable. The more she laughed out loud in front of others, the more I knew her laughter was supported by a fragile foundation, one I could dismantle at the right moment. Those days felt like a prelude. The air was heavy, the house was in suspense, her expressions were slowly changing. Everything indicated we were approaching a breaking point, where nothing could remain hidden. And I knew that when that moment arrived, the impact wouldn't be limited to the two of us. The house's atmosphere was beginning to transform into an invisible stage. Every corner seemed to hold secrets, every closed door whispered a truth yet to be revealed. I walked the hallways feeling the walls watching, complicit in the silence I cultivated. There was an anticipation in the air, as if every object was waiting for the moment the mask would fall. My daughter, for her part, seemed oblivious. She smiled broadly when guests came, talked loudly about accomplishments that weren't hers, and laughed as if the world were at her feet. But I saw the cracks, the glances that quickly shifted, the need to constantly reiterate what should have been obvious. The more she sought to assert her power, the more evident her fragility became. Within me the contrast grew. The confidence of knowing I held the keys to her destiny mingled with a silent doubt. How far should I go? There were nights when fear tightened my chest, whispering that perhaps I was about to lose control. But then the memory of those cruel words, the image of the contempt written on her face, would come, and the strength would return like distant thunder, announcing its arrival before it broke the sky. It was like standing at a window in the middle of a storm. On one side, the heavy, deafening rain, covering everything with uncertainty. On the other, lightning streaked across the sky, momentarily illuminating the clarity of the path. This wavering kept me awake, reminding me that each choice would be final, and that the moment of revelation was approaching faster than I imagined. Time seemed to compress. Days passed like hours, and her every gesture, every uttered sentence, felt like part of a larger plot that was about to unfold. The suspense grew, and I knew there would be no turning back when the curtain finally rose. And then came the moment when all the pieces fell into place. What had previously seemed merely an accumulation of silences revealed itself as a plan drawn up in minute detail. I stood before her, and all around me were attentive gazes, unwitting witnesses to a truth that could no longer be hidden. In that moment, I realized that my voice, so often ignored, carried the weight of thunder splitting the sky in the dead of night. The papers she'd left lying around, the signatures she'd asked me for, never knowing I'd read every line, were now there, exposed, revealing dependencies, lies, illusions. Her confident smile froze on her face as she realized the foundation on which she'd built her arrogance was crumbling. It was like watching a house of cards collapse in slow motion. Fragile, inevitable, quietly devastating. Within me there was no hatred. There was a deep, almost luminous calm. Because in that moment, I understood that true revenge wasn't about shouting or humiliating. It was simply about returning the weight of choices to those who tried to transfer it to me. The contrast was stark. On one side, her desperation trying to keep up appearances. On the other, my firm, serene posture, sustained by everything I'd learned throughout my life. It's in these kinds of moments that we understand why so many people feel moved to like, comment, and subscribe, as if they were also leaving their mark on this journey. Because each story like this is, in fact, a shared story. Of mothers, of women, of people who learned that kindness is not synonymous with weakness, and that silence is not absence, but strategy. When I walked away from that scene, I felt as if the air had become lighter. It was like leaving a dark room and walking into the light of day. I carried no resentment, only the certainty that I had regained something greater than any material possession, my own dignity. And by sharing this now, I leave everyone with the feeling that the privilege is not just mine, but that of all who recognize themselves in this journey of pain transformed into strength, of failure converted into rebirth.